Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to join this virtual Round the World festival and delighted to connect with so many from across the globe. I speak from a beautiful setting, the Gardens by the Bay, in the heart of Singapore, and what better location to speak about cities than from this location. Within no more than 5 kilometers from where I'm standing is my university, the Singapore Management University, which is privileged to be located in the heart of the city, surrounded by historic and cultural monuments, by the financial district, the high courts, a thriving innovation and entrepreneurship community with VCs, with student startups, with co-working spaces, and so forth. Speaking from where I stand, it's easy to forget that there are many challenges that confront cities around the world. And so let me begin by acknowledging these challenges, from overcrowding to pollution to congestion and so forth. But at the same time, cities are centers of economic activity, and they continue to attract businesses to create value and opportunities. In fact, so successful are they with attracting businesses that we have been warned by intellectuals and scholars alike that we are in danger of having cities become places that are harder and harder in which to live. The stresses of city living have caused, in some instances, life in its real sense to be lost. But people continue to flock to cities. Why? Why do cities attract people? Why do they attract businesses? What sorts of different value, whether material or symbolic, do they create that they are able to attract people to the cities? Cities exert a centripetal force on countries and regions, and people are drawn to them. They're like magnets attracting people from around the country. And in cities or countries that are experiencing growth, rapid economic growth, that process of movement and mobility from the country to the city is going to continue, in my view, even with COVID. That movement, that mobility is not only from the country to the city, it is also occurring between cities, from smaller cities to larger cities and between global cities. Why are cities so attractive? Because they offer the promise of greater socioeconomic mobility. Because they are diverse and interesting places to live in. They have some of the most interesting architectures, and they attract the most innovative people and businesses. But as I have intimated already, cities pose and face existential challenges. As they grow and change, the one significant challenge around the world must be the question of how to create a sustainable city in all its multifaceted dimensions. In maintaining social sustainability, economic sustainability, and of course, environmental sustainability. Or as some say, we need to address questions around, or issues around, people, profit, and planet. The multiple dimensions of sustainability have been depicted in different ways. On the left of the screen is a depiction that the United Nations has used, but my preference is the one on the right, which can be found easily on Wikipedia. And I will return to these various dimensions of sustainability soon in relation to the Singapore experience. I want to highlight first that in recent times, the Singapore that has captured the world's imagination is very much that of the crazy rich Asian city. But I want to recognize that the real Singapore is no exception to other cities in being confronted by challenges of sustainability and in developing solutions that address these challenges. In Singapore's case, its sustainability is affected by having no natural resources, scarce land, no hinterland, challenges to food and water security, delicately balanced religious and ethnic, domestic and external relations, and a rapidly aging population. We are in a low-lying island, a very small island, 700 square kilometers, very low-lying, amidst rising sea levels. So the challenges that Singapore faces are non-trivial, and certainly the world of the crazy rich Asians paints a much rosier picture than perhaps we need to confront. So first, as context, let me remind everyone that Singapore is a city-state. The city is the state is the city. And given the smallness of the city-state, parts of the island are very often used as a living laboratory for achieving sustainability, such as, in this slide, I show you the picture of a new smart housing new town called Tengah, which is piloting a car-free town centre and a forest town approach, cloaked as it is in greenery. But I also want to share that the city and the city-state is a living classroom. And speaking as an educator, this is extremely close to my heart. The experiential learning that we do in my university, for example, is very insistently a part of our pedagogical approach, especially because we have our city literally at our doorsteps. So with this context of a small city-state, a living laboratory, and a living classroom, perhaps we could turn attention now to looking at different dimensions of sustainability in Singapore. Let me begin with social sustainability. And by this, I refer to various dimensions: social inclusion, the building of community bonds, health and well-being, community resistance, social responsibility, and so forth. In a recent forum on bouncing back from COVID-19, the CEO of our Housing and Development Board, that development board which takes care of housing for some 80% of the Singapore population in high-rise buildings, was thinking ahead about a post-COVID world, the health crisis, and the implications for urban planning. And some of the ideas that were discussed included building self-sufficient neighborhoods that can shut down if necessary during a pandemic season, where jobs are available internally, where health services are available there, where retail is there, where schools are contained within, and that self-sufficient neighborhood can be shut down and exist as a bubble. Other ideas include what are in place in many places, in many other cities: contactless door handles, lift buttons, water taps, and so forth. But very importantly, as telecommuting increases, how do we design living spaces so that it is comfortable, that it can function alternately as home and office space at the same time? And for a housing and development board that is responsible for 80% of the population's living environment, these questions are absolutely critical. But it is not just about urban planning and urban design, important as it is also about social care and community care for a community that might find itself isolated during periods of lockdown. And so Singapore's concept of ambassadors has been rolled out in a very deliberate way, where there are what are called pioneer generation ambassadors, silver generation ambassadors, who are out there looking after the elderly population, making sure that they are aware of the services that are available to them, and so forth. There are safe distancing ambassadors who are out there reminding people to keep a distance between one another for safety and security. So some of these efforts on the part of Singapore, I would say, are very much led by a government that is very concerned about the well-being of its population. In many places, the efforts to address social sustainability are led by government. In some cities, where governments perhaps are not stepping up the way in which they might, business leaders have taken on the lead. But I want to draw attention to the fact that universities as academic institutions play a very important role in supporting the work of social sustainability as well. And I would just like to cite some examples from my own institution, which I'm sure are mirrored in different parts of the world as well. Let me cite the example of universities co-creating social sustainability from the perspective of enhancing elder care. We run a center called the Center for Successful Aging. ROSA for short, Research on Successful Aging. And basically what the center does is to have a data pool, a database of 12,000 elderly people in the city who are surveyed on a monthly basis. And that allows us to collect data and have insights into the well-being of an elderly population in real time. So as COVID struck in January, we could see the impacts in February, in March, in April, and so forth. And this allows us to push data and insights to policy departments in a way that they are then able to devise policy in a very timely way to meet the needs of the elderly population. Let me cite a second example of universities co-creating social sustainability, and this is about addressing food insecurity. Now, many people think that Singapore is a very rich city, and in some ways it is. But a study that was recently completed by our Lien Center for Social Innovation realized that actually there is a significant amount of food insecurity in Singapore that goes unmet. And so that work has been done in collaboration with an entity called the Food Bank Singapore, an NGO that is there to respond to these research findings by making sure that food is delivered to those with food insecurity. A third example on how universities co-create social sustainability, a study that I'm particularly proud of, where our undergraduates worked on a project called Remember For Me. And what they did was to conduct the first nationwide survey on dementia, understanding people's attitudes towards dementia and understanding attitudes towards dementia in the hope that their results and their findings might be able to feed into government agencies as well as NGOs that are supporting this cause. These examples give me a lot of satisfaction in being an educator, where the research of our faculty as well as the work that our students do can make meaningful impact on the city and its community. Let me turn now to economic sustainability. Here we're talking about sustaining a level of economic production and economic growth and well-being over long periods of time. And again, in the context of Singapore, it is not uncommon for people to think of Singapore as that crazy rich Asian city. After all, the World Bank cites Singapore as one of the world's most business-friendly regulatory environments and amongst the world's most competitive economies. If you look at the World Bank Human Capital Index, Singapore is ranked number 1. If you look at the Bloomberg Innovation Index, Singapore is ranked number 3 globally for innovation. So it's easy to go away thinking that here is an economically thriving city. And yes, that has a certain element of truth. But at the same time, if we're thinking about economically sustainable practices, I think it's important for us to think about things like sustainable finance and green finance. How do we ensure that the economic activities support practices, economic practices that are friendly to the environment? And here I introduce to you some of the work that my colleagues have done on sustainable finance and our effort to try and set up a green finance center. This will be announced very soon, and so you're the first audience to hear about it. At the same time, there are many other dimensions of economic sustainability that we need to think about precisely because of COVID-19. My colleagues have done work in the following areas, as you see on the screen. For example, how do marketing departments behave? How should they behave during a recession that is brought on by a pandemic? Should you be cutting marketing budgets, or should you actually be turning attention to supporting marketing budgets? How do you build a data-driven financial system, and how is that impacted by COVID? How does management research need to take a societal turn? And how do we deal with global supply chain breaks during a period like the pandemic? So the kinds of thought leadership that can come out of universities, and I dare say SMU is not alone in that, the thought leadership that comes out of universities, to me, is critical in the making of better cities. Let me turn now to environmental sustainability. This is about meeting current human needs without jeopardizing the ability of future generations to meet their needs. And I've already intimated about the existential crisis that Singapore does face as a low-lying island surrounded by waters. So Singapore's approach has been multifold, and I cite just some examples. Building defences against rising global sea levels. Much of Singapore lies only 15 meters above the mean sea level, and 30% lie less than 5 meters above the mean sea level. Can you imagine when sea level rises, what is to happen? And so the government expects to spend an estimated 100 billion Singapore dollars over 100 years to provide solutions by reclaiming offshore islands, by building barrages, creating polders, and so forth. Of course, there are many other initiatives in addressing environmental sustainability, in reducing carbon footprint, in promoting clean energy, in stepping up on recycling in a city that is already very conscious about recycling, doing that at a 60% rate. Now, where do universities come in co-creating environmental sustainabilities? I cite the example again of SMU, where we're located in the heart of the city, where urban heat islands are non-trivial. A study that a colleague of mine conducted showed that between the heart of the city, where the buildings are most dense, and a much more suburban part of the city, the difference in temperature could be as high as 7 degrees Celsius. And so, what part can we play in the heart of the city as a university with our buildings located in this urban heat island? Our new building is what you see on the screen, opened this year in January before we closed it down quite rapidly with COVID. But SMU Connection, as we call it, is the first on-site net zero energy building in the heart of the city centre. We have rooftop panels on all our SMU buildings, which form the largest solar plant in the city centre. We have set targets for energy consumption, or rather the reduction of energy consumption and water consumption over the last several years, and I'm very happy to say that the targets that we set for 2020, we have reached. And so we are about to set our next phase of targets for energy reduction and water reduction. We ensure that in the classroom we are imparting values of environmental sustainability and generating debate and dialogue about these issues. And you see on the screen many examples of the sorts of causes that our students are exposed to. One of the things that I would like to say is that a lot of what we do, precisely because the city is a living classroom, is the experiential learning. We get our students out to do projects associated with these causes so that the outcomes of their projects are actually usable ideas and solutions by companies, by NGOs, and by government departments. We have a project that a colleague of mine is co-leading called Cooling Singapore 2.0, and I tell him to hurry up because our thermal comfort depends on him. So, from the classroom to beyond the classroom, to research that our colleagues do, and very importantly, to our alumni and our students who start up businesses that are conscious about environmental sustainability and contribute to the betterment of the environment. I cite one example of 3 graduates from the Singapore Management University together with another university in Singapore, the Nanyang Technological University. They saw a business opportunity in distributing food that would otherwise go to waste. Their concern was in not wasting food. So in 2017, the 3 of them founded a company called 3 Dots, a social enterprise that aims to channel unsold produce from wholesalers and slaughterhouses to food and beverage businesses. Very often, the food that they see going to waste might not look as nice, but are perfectly edible. And so what they've done is to create a platform that connects suppliers and the users and they provide the logistics to deliver these products. And in so doing, they have been able to save a whole lot of food that would have otherwise gone to waste. They are right now, despite COVID, planning to expand in the Southeast Asian region, and their plans to expand into Malaysia are well underway, and they're looking now at Indonesia, Korea, and Japan. Now, nearly 4 decades ago, when I was an undergraduate, in 1982, the French geographer Jean Gottman asked the question of whether, with the increasing use of telecommunications technology, cities would face dissolution. To address sustainability issues with telecommunications, people could work from wherever they lived, and there was no need for them to come into the city. Today, with COVID, similar questions are being asked. Companies have rapidly deployed digital technologies to enable employees to work from home during the pandemic. But you know what? Gottman's conclusion was that an urban renaissance was much more likely than urban dissolution, despite the growth of telecommunication technologies, rather than the dispersal of transactional activities away from the city. He was of the view that telecommunication actually promotes greater agglomeration, because as telecommunications puts people in contact with one another, human nature is such that people feel the need to actually meet the person that they're meeting on that little Zoom square in their living rooms. And so, human nature being gregarious as social beings, the sense that people would want to come together when circumstances allow, underpin Jean Gottman's thinking from 1982, that rather than urban dissolution, an urban renaissance was actually going to take place. At its heart, a sustainable city is one that recognizes the humanity of cities. In spite of all the challenges of COVID, the presumed push towards disaggregation of cities may not happen. And what perhaps makes for resilient cities at the end of the day is the human spirit. I come back to Singapore, where Singapore, as a city-state, is striving for sustainability in its multifaceted dimensions. SMU, as a city university located in the heart of the city, strives to co-create that sustainability as many other universities do. The city, at the end of the day, is not just a place where business goes on, but where life goes on. Thank you.
Greetings. My name is James Andrade. I'm from Capitaland, Singapore. And it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Lily Kong, President of SMU. Lily.
Thank you.
Welcome. And I have to say, I enjoyed your presentation very much.
Thank you. That's very kind.
It's outstanding. You know, I was struck by your comment about Singapore is not the crazy rich Asians depiction that was shown. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about Singapore that people don't see. Maybe give us a little bit of background on Singapore and SMU.
Delighted to do that. So Singapore, as I mentioned, is a tiny city, state, and island, all 700 square kilometers. What we see in Crazy Rich Asian is a very rich city, expansive mansions and so forth. But the reality is that 80% of the population lives in high-rise that is publicly built and provided. And the Housing and Development Board has been in existence for 60 years now doing that job. While the vast majority of Singaporeans, I think, live in good comfort, I would say that poverty exists, food insecurity exists. I remember some years ago, as I did my own research and visited rental apartments in the heart of the city, you would find elderly people living alone who had been construction workers, women construction workers. They had come to Singapore from southern China decades ago, helped to build the Singapore that we all see today that is gleaming and so forth. And many of them are single, elderly women on their own. Walking down the corridors, you feel the sense of darkness and dankness. You feel the sense of lost hope. Mind you, this is not prevalent in Singapore at all, but any small number of a population that lives in that way must be cause for attention from the government, from the volunteer sector, and I would say businesses should be concerned about this as well. So the contrast between the rich and the poor, the contrast between the gleaming new buildings and the historic districts, Singapore I would characterize as a city of contrasts.
It's a very, very interesting, balanced depiction of Singapore. You know, one aspect of Singapore that is getting a lot of attention and is looked at as a model is the notion of smart cities. Maybe you can tell us, what makes a city smart?
So this is a really interesting question. I've looked at the literature because this is research that I've been doing recently. And very often cities think of smartness in terms of how fast the Wi-Fi speed is, what kinds of technologies are available. And it's defined very much by hardware in terms of what's available. But a smart city to me is really about the outcomes, not about the means to the end. It is about what those technologies do to enable a better life for people. So to me, the definitions and the measures of smart cities as they exist today tend too much to be about input and about hardware rather than about outcomes and software.
Very well said. You know, I want to pick up on that theme of people. You mentioned social sustainability. And one of the things that research is showing around the globe is the significant amount of stress that people are experiencing in their personal lives and in their work life as well. We've seen this demonstrated quite broadly. Many sociologists have said that the stress of city life is a major contributor to this overall stress that folks are feeling. Can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on how cities can help in this silent epidemic and the role that architecture and urban planning can play?
So this is a question close to my heart. In many cities, in many Asian cities, young people are afflicted by this silent pandemic. The suicide rates that we see around the world amongst young people are high. And I think it's important that we address this early. And so there are both preventive ways that we can think of as well as defensive ways. In terms of city planning, I think there is no guarantee. I don't want to be an environmental determinist, but I do think that there are things we can do with a city landscape that encourage and facilitate mindfulness, that give people a chance to get away from the hustle and bustle into a park where you can sit and reflect and have a little bit of silence and quiet time, where there are support systems that are available and easily identifiable. So the preventive ways are very much about city planning. And then there are ways in which we can begin to think about early identification. And one of my colleagues at the Singapore Management University has this ambition to do some research which uses technology to spot when somebody's behavior patterns are at an early stage of demonstrating stress. For example, in his theory, in his hypothesis, the way in which somebody is walking, the way in which somebody is not moving. And so he has this ambition to do this research project that allows for early identification. But of course, it is also defensive in the sense that when trouble strikes, do we have the social network that is in place to support people in need? And I'm very proud of a program that my students have developed called the Peer Helpers Program, because it's not always about counselors and professors who identify when students are at risk. It is students among students helping one another. And they've developed training programs for themselves. They've taken this training program out into other institutions of higher learning. And I think that sort of social network and social compact is what is going to make for more resilient cities.
You know, I want to pick up a little bit on this notion of Singapore as a living laboratory that you mentioned earlier, and in particular drawing on your background in terms of social culture and urban geography. What do you believe that cities can teach us that we can't learn in the classroom?
So first, I'm always reminded with a question like this of a Chinese proverb, and I'm actually going to try and say it, 百闻不如一见, which is that you can you can listen to something 100 times. It does not beat seeing it that one time. And that example that I cited earlier of me walking down the corridors of rental apartments in Singapore was an absolute educational experience for me. I know theoretically about poverty. I read about poverty lines and Gini coefficients, and I can calculate that for you. But it's nothing compared to walking down that corridor and seeing it for yourself. And so if we are to truly educate, I think we need to have students out in the city, observing what's going on and interacting with what's going on. But I hasten to add that while this is a forum on the city, just to use the words of Raymond Williams from, way back when, that intellectual from Wales who talked about the country and the city. Much as we can learn a great deal from the city, we also learn a great deal from the country. The moral of the story for me is getting students out into the world in experiential learning.
You know, I want to pick up on that theme of getting students out in the world, particularly in light of the COVID pandemic. We've had to rethink not only of where the workplace is, but I'm sure that you've also had to rethink of where the classroom is. And this whole concept of city as a campus or city as a classroom is probably one that you've given quite a bit of thought to. Can you tell us a little bit about what your concept of city as a classroom is and how you see this playing out in a post-COVID world, the impact that it's going to have on SMU and the faculty and the students?
So thank you for that question. It's one that I've fretted about because I'm such a firm believer in getting students out into the world. And I think that it is possible to recreate something of that, but it is not possible to replicate it. So just as an example, if we're talking about poverty and marginalized populations or marginal populations and how we as a university, through our students and our thought leadership and research, can make a difference, I do think that it is possible to recreate conditions where students are in touch with that community out there. So just to cite an example, we believe in education that is not just academic, important as that is. We believe in education through community work, through service learning, through internships, and so forth. So just citing the example of the community service work that all our students do. On average, our students do 140 hours of community work before they graduate. And because of COVID, they've not been able to be out in the community. They've not been able to hold the hands of an elderly person, give them comfort where comfort is needed. What they've done instead is to produce material, translated material that can be used by a foreign worker population to educate them about what COVID means, what good hygiene means. What they've done is to develop a system where they are giving comfort to people over the phone not through Zoom and all that, because some populations, some segments of the population are not that technologically advanced in a smart city. And so they've used quite basic technology in recording material in vernacular languages. They've used the phone to talk to people and give comfort and so forth. And they've devised ways in which they can reach out to the community through telecommunications. And it's, as I said, not the same as holding someone's hands and looking them in the eye. It recreates, but it does not replicate.
You know, I'm struck, and I'm sure that that folks that will be seeing this, the passion and empathy that you speak about connecting students to the communities that they reside in. Are there some disciplines or some areas in the university that lend themselves more to the concept of community as a classroom? I came from the hard sciences,
Right.
and so I had to stay in the laboratory. But are there some disciplines that actually lend themselves more to this concept?
So I'm really happy to have joined my university 5 years ago from another comprehensive university where I was dealing with dentistry and chemistry and so forth, right? The disciplines that we have at the Singapore Management University are broadly in the social sciences, very broadly defined, including business, law, accountancy, social sciences as we know it, economics, sociology, political science. We also have a technology school in the form of information systems and computer science. And I'm really delighted because all these disciplines lend themselves to being out there with the world. It may not be so intuitive to think of a computer scientist or a computer science student who is into coding, thinking about being connected to the university. But my response to that is twofold. One, the projects that they do can and must have a human element. What are they coding for? What are they writing code for? They're writing code principally to make someone's life better. And to be able to do that, you need to understand that someone, that community, what their needs are. And so I remember years ago during the Aceh tsunami, when earthquakes struck in Indonesia, as they do, but this was a particularly difficult one where the tsunamis wiped away many lives and there were many orphans left. And our students from information systems were writing up programs, developing platforms where the NGOs could track who these orphans were, where they were, what education they were being exposed to, what was lacking in the profile of the individual, that the NGOs could come in. And I am told that from 2004, I think, when this occurred, till now, a good 16 years away, that same instrument is still in use. I think many disciplines, even the non-intuitive ones, lend themselves to that connection with the community.
That's an excellent point. You know, I want to change gears a little bit. Many people will learn that you completed your doctoral studies in geography in the University of College London. I want to ask you a little bit about other cities. We know that the concept of this city as a campus or classroom could be applied to the UK. And you know, there are some very old cities, with quite a bit of history. Is there anything that can be learned by Singapore from such cities, older cities, particularly in this post-COVID period?
So I think of my days in London with great fondness, a city of history and culture, and you know, in that respect, very different from a young Singapore. I remember a friend of mine who was studying music, and she's a music composer now. And the fact that she was, you know, sort of living next to me in the dorm in London, in Russell Square in the heart of the city, she didn't need her professor to take her to the Barbican. She didn't need her professor to take her to the Royal Concert Hall the Philharmonic and so forth, it was natural. It came naturally to her that on the weekends, that's where she would go and she would learn from others who were performing. She would meet others who were composing and so forth. And what I learned from that is that much as we think of the role of educators as really important, and it is, speaking as an educator, learning to learn oneself is so important. And the environment, the city environment, must provide that stimulation for young people to say, there's something I'm learning from this, without a professor standing by and saying, let me point that out to you about urban planning, or let me point that out to you about architecture. Because the stimulation of the environment is the education.
You know, I want to talk about the environment a little bit differently, particularly in the context of sustainability.
Yes.
Your example that you used of the students that started the not-for-profit 3 Dot was quite impressive. And if students can make these types of efforts, the question is, what more should governments and businesses be doing to contribute?
Yes. So I believe very much in a thriving innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem, because that's where you get new ideas. And for an ecosystem like this to exist and thrive, you absolutely need government, business, and academia in that triple helix context to work together. Governments have the role of providing funding for research, and the kinds of research that they're willing to support can generate new ideas for the well-being of the city. Governments have a role in regulation, providing regulatory frameworks, but if it's too tight a regulatory framework, it kills innovation. Governments have that ability to say, here's a sandbox, and you can go experiment and do things. Industry have critical roles to play. They can be the ones that are sponsoring research labs, mentoring students, young people, working together with universities. And universities have a critical role to play. The professors are the ones who are very often at the cutting edge of research, coming up with new ideas that can contribute to environmental sustainability and other kinds of sustainability. The professors have a critical role in mentoring young people, giving them space to grow, come up with new ideas, being encouraging, not being critical of failure. So that triple helix is one that I believe in, that can create an innovative and entrepreneurial environment that will make for cities that thrive.
You know, you authored a book, The Politics of Landscapes in Singapore, and it actually pulls on several of those threads. You explored the impact of globalization on the development of landscape and ultimately the institution of nation. How do you assess the impact of the COVID pandemic on these constructs, and what aspects of change do you see as transient, and which ones of those do you see as more long-lasting?
So that's a big question. So first, cities, countries are impacted by globalization, and there is a danger of losing a sense of identity, because if you go to this city and that city, they look alike. You go into a shopping mall, and that shopping mall, you're likely to have a chain where the experience of walking through those shops is actually quite similar. You can forget which city you're in because those retail experiences might be quite similar. You can be working in the headquarters of a company in city A and the branch office in city B, and there could be significant similarities that make you forget that you're in a different city. So globalization has that impact of homogenization. But in the face of globalization is a counterforce of localization. And that in the same way that McDonald's produces a burger in America, where you come from, you also have a burger in Singapore, but it's localized because you have rendang burger or chicken rice burger or nasi lemak burger or something. So the forces of globalization and localization are always working side by side. And what I was interested to explore in the city was how the landscape creates a sense of nation and identity in the face of globalization. What happens with COVID is that perhaps actually localization is strengthened still more because mobility is restricted.
Yes.
People retreat into their homes and people create their senses of identity built very much on the here and now and the bubble that they have to be in. There is a danger in that. There is a danger in people and countries and cities looking inwards. I believe that cities and countries and humanity thrives when the multiplicities are allowed to surface, emerge, and develop character from there. So it is when cultures meet other cultures, it is when practices meet other practices that something new emerges.
You know, it's an issue that we're grappling with globally right now, and it's interesting to see how different nations are trying to navigate and maneuver through this issue. You know, we could talk for hours on this subject alone, but I do have two final questions that I'd like to ask you before we wrap up. I want to bring the discussion back to more of a academic institutional level. Your students and workers all over have become accustomed to the whole remote aspect of either doing business or of learning. How do you see things returning to a more normal routine? Or do you see lasting change in certain areas?
That's a difficult question. I think that there are colleagues and students alike who say, I don't want to go back to the office. I'm happy learning from sitting at the screen. And there are others who say, this is dreadful. I miss my colleagues. I want to have the coffee and the serendipitous encounter in the elevator where I might speak to someone. And I think that tension is going to continue because people will make choices. And as the pandemic plays out, and who knows how it's going to play out, we're going to have some lasting changes in the sense that the blended life is going to be a reality. That it's neither going to be, it's not going to be either or, it's going to be both and. It's going to be both on screen and mediated, and it's going to be off screen and in person. And different circumstances will call for each of those to be foregrounded. I think some of the things that we've learned would be how to use the on-screen medium to recreate something of the off-screen. So for example, do we use technology to deliver lessons in the classroom by having a talking head, which you can record in advance and students can turn on and turn off as they wish at will? Or do we use technology to actually try and enhance human interaction so that there is dialogue and debate online? Not the same perhaps as doing it in person, maybe, but at least it's human interaction, synchronous human interaction.
You know, at the heart of your answer and what we're also seeing in business is the notion of community. At the heart, people need to have a sense of community, and that is going to be the challenge.
Absolutely.
Well, I have a very easy question for your final question. Can you tell us what you see the future of education and international studies being?
A very easy question indeed. I believe, there was a period not so long ago when those massive open online courses took the world by storm. And people thought, well, this is it. Who needs universities anymore? Who needs schools anymore when people can learn online? They can pick and choose whatever they want, mix and match, create their own education. And COVID might have exacerbated that sort of thinking, right? you can't go to campus, well, you've got all these courses online. I beg to differ. Just as we were saying that, at the end of the day, human beings need community. I think that learning is a social activity in as much as it is a personal activity. And so, as an educational philosophy for SMU, as provost a few years ago, I had deep discussions with my colleagues, and we agreed on three things: that the student is an individual who has personalized learning needs, that the student is a social being who learns through interaction and community, from their peers, from the community, and the student is a member of a larger community, that they learn from the city and the community as classroom in as much as we hope they give back to the city and the community. And so even with COVID, I think these three fundamental perspectives of what a student is remain: as an individual, as a social being, as a member of a community.
Outstanding. Professor Lily Kong, President of Singapore Management University, thank you very much for your thoughts and your comments.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you for the conversation.